Sorry for my delayed entry. I was hoping to do a bit like... I was hoping, were you at the Mosseri talk earlier on Adam Mosseri, the head of Newsfeed? He sort of entered very gloriously, as they do in Silicon Valley, or pretend claps. Anyway, welcome all. Fact-checking is a topic that has been on a lot of front pages. There has been a lot of concern as to whether this tool is useless, as to whether this tool is done for, and that we should just give up on reality and truths. I hope we will spend an hour speaking without cliches about what fact-checking can and can't do. I am thrilled to do that with people who actually know what they're talking about. The challenge with when a topic becomes popular is that everyone thinks they should get an opinion about it, and definitely fact-checking hasn't been an exception. So, from nearest to me, Lucas Graves is a professor of journalism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has literally written the book about American fact-checking for Columbia University Press. Next up, Phoebe Arnold is the head of communications of the great British fact-checking site Full Fact. They are an extremely thoughtful fact-checking organization when it comes to the impact of their work. So I'm delighted to have her with us. And then last but not least is my former colleague Giovanni Zagni, who runs the Italian fact-checking site Pagella Politica. And I guess a bit of who the hell am I is probably in place. My name is Alexis Mansarlis, and as of September 2015, I am the director of the International Fact-Checking Network. If that means nothing to you, and I say this all the time, it means nothing to a lot of people, including my father and the customs officials, who sort of do this when I tell them what my job is. But the International Fact-Checking Network is an alliance of fact-checking organizations, more than 100 around the world. We try to promote high standards among fact-checkers and share best practices. You may have seen us in the news most recently because in December, when Facebook decided to start fighting fake news in one way or another, they leaned on third-party fact-checkers. Those fact-checkers have to have signed on to the code of principles that the organization I lead has published. So what are we going to do today? We'll talk a little bit about how we got here, right? The problem when something gets really popular is that we presume it just started. And there's obviously a bit of history, and I'm glad obviously Lucas will help us go through that. We'll look, because it's in everyone's mind, what the fuck happened in 2016 around the world. I'm sure I'm not going to be delicate. A lot of fucks happened. And then we're going to think a bit of where we're going next. What does fact-checking need to do to adapt to this new context in which we're in, and what is not in fact-checking's purview. And then we'll give 15 minutes for Q&A. There are so many festivals in which, so many journalism talks have been in the past 6 weeks, where it's all among journalists, it's all closed doors. I'm so thrilled to have the public, for this to be an open event. So your hardest possible questions, the panelists will be happy to receive them. Right? There's only one rule to this panel, and it's important for you to know it. If you say post-truth or post-fact to someone on this panel, we'll take a shot. So please don't make us reach the end of this panel totally drunk. And there is one premise that I want to make, because so much coverage has been about, lol, do facts even matter? Yes, facts do matter. This is the most recent of studies that showed that corrections on Trump voters of Trump misinformation did change their minds, did improve the accuracy of their understanding. And we can talk about this later, but I just want to make sure that we don't spend an hour either thinking this is the perfect tool or inversely thinking, why are we even bothering? It's a bunch of it's a very nuanced situation, and I hope we'll walk through it together. All right, so for the first part of our chat, I'm turning to Lucas, who is sort of a sociologist and a historian of the American fact-checking scene. Obviously, for those of you who don't know, political fact-checking in the United States sort of broke through with factcheck.org in 2003 and then PolitiFact winning the Pulitzer in 2008, but it goes even further back. So I wanted to ask Lucas to sort of set the stage before we even get to 2016. How did we get here? Can you tell us a little bit about the early history of fact-checking? Where did it start, and what were some of its innovations?
Sure. So,
is it on? You may need to press. Great.
Sure, I'm happy to. So, first of all, I think it's really important to underscore that for most of the 20th century, directly challenging political claims, even claims that were clearly false, was not the norm for American journalists, who very often were, quite close to the officials they were covering, and felt, would have felt uncomfortable challenging their claims. There was a reporter in the wake of the Red Scare, the sort of communist witch hunts in the 1950s in the U.S., who complained that the objectivity norm in journalism, had become basically a transmission belt for falsehoods during the Red Scare, because politicians like Joe McCarthy, these demagogues, could count on journalists to faithfully repeat and report, their wildest claims about the number of communists in the State Department and so on. But you do see, in the wake of Watergate and Vietnam, sort of a turn towards more aggressive reporting, more investigative reporting, more critical analysis of politics by American journalists, and the move towards fact-checking is a part of that, of that larger shift. So I think the first, really clear burst in fact-checking in the United States by nonpartisan reporters comes under President Reagan in the 1980s. Reagan came into office with this really well-established reputation for mangling the details of all of the government programs that he was going to slash. And so some reporters got in the habit of running little boxes next to the pieces, reporting on his speeches, for instance, or his press conferences. They would run these little fact-checking boxes. They sometimes called these truth boxes, correcting his claims. Then we saw another turning point in 1988 in the presidential race that year, which saw a lot of really harsh negative advertising, which was filled with false claims. And so journalists in the wake of that campaign felt that they hadn't covered it very well. And so you had this really fairly open conversation about the fact that journalists needed to be more aggressive in pointing out these, political deceptions. And so through the 1990s, you saw a surge in what are called ad watch pieces. So these are, reports on TV or in the newspaper analyzing false claims made in political ads. But the internet, and I'll stop very quickly now, Alexia, so you can follow up. The internet really changed the landscape because it made it possible to have, outlets that were dedicated to checking political claims. So we start to see that in the mid-1990s with the website Snopes. But factcheck.org, which came on the scene in 2003, was the first outlet, the first organization dedicated, completely and full-time to investigating political claims and telling readers whether or not they're true. So that really inaugurates, I think, a new phase in modern American reporting.
Posso chiedere un attimo ai tecnici di farci vedere la slide? All right, so just because a bit of 1980s screenshots are always good for the spirit of a room. So this was what you were referring to, right? That box on the facts. Okay, so give us a bit of the backstory. I was wondering what kind of signs were there in the first decade or so of fact-checking in the way that we recognize it now, so from factcheck.org onwards, were there of what happened in 2016? I'm particularly interested in two things that I read in your book. First, partisan-motivated attacks on fact-checking, which happened before, right? Yeah. And the other is this tension that may seem abstruse and academic, but that really spoke to me between the literalist strand of fact-checking, so maybe you can explain what it is, and the contextualist strand of fact-checking.
Sure. So, you see a lot of the patterns that we're all familiar with today emerge pretty early on in the history of fact-checking. So, one consistent pattern is that politicians will reject fact checks that go against their side, or efforts to debunk things they say, but then very happily cite and promote fact checks that they agree with that go against their opponents. We saw this from the very earliest days. So Reagan responded to all of the coverage of his many mistakes and errors by accusing journalists of journalistic incest. He thought that they shouldn't be harping on all of these stories about his very public mistakes. You also see, and I think this is more interesting, how awkward it can be for journalists to try to, for nonpartisan journalists, for objective journalists, to engage in fact-checking. So even in the 1980s and the 1990s, they bend over backwards to try to balance their fact-checking so that they can show the audience that they're not taking sides, even when they debunk claims from one party or the other. That becomes very difficult when there are sort of provably greater or more falsehoods coming from one side. So even in that 1988 race that I mentioned, it was really clear that the Republican commercials in that race were much more egregious in terms of all of the the falsehoods that they were offering. But the journalists covering that race tried really hard to fact check both sides, to the point that some of them later complained that their editors or their producers would force them to artificially balance these stories when the reality was not balanced. And that was that's a theme that we hear today as well. And then, yes, also, as Alexios says, kind of throughout the history of fact-checking, you see this war between contextualist and literalist interpretations. That just means that one way to disagree with a fact-check is to say that, that the fact-checkers are being slaves to the facts, that they're ignoring the broader truth, that, the broader point that's being made. So in 2012, for instance, a lot of progressives attacked fact-checkers in the U.S. for debunking the claim that a budget proposed by the Republicans would, quote-unquote, end Medicare. And, there was still going to be a program called Medicare. It was going to suffer some pretty severe cuts, but it wasn't going to be eliminated. And so the fact-checkers said, well, this claim is clearly false. But Democrats and progressives said, well, you're ignoring the larger point that the spirit of this program, the things that have defined this program, will be ended. So, so in that larger context, the program is, will be eliminated. People very happily switch poles and complain that fact checkers are, ignoring the details, ignoring obvious facts when they go too far in interpreting, the broader significance of a fact check.
I guess maybe just one sentence, because you and Federica Cherubini for the Reuters Institute of Journalism wrote an overview of fact-checking in Europe. Could you maybe give us really like a spark note of what you found?
Sure. So really briefly, I think there are two large and really, really compelling findings. One is just how quickly fact-checking has grown and spread across Europe in a relatively short period of time. So I think now there's something like, when we were finishing the report, there were almost 35 outlets operating in 20 different countries in all different parts of Europe. I'm pretty sure the figure is higher, given some of the recent launches. Now, almost all of those outlets, all but 3 or 4, were launched since 2010. So this is a very new and a very fast-growing phenomenon. It's also really interesting that the landscape of fact-checkers is much more diverse in Europe than what we've seen in the United States. In the United States, this field is dominated by journalists, but across Europe, you see, political activists, NGOs, independent watchdog groups with no background in journalism, taking a really active role in leading the fact-checking movement, and so that's an important difference.
All right, thank you. Before we move on to our European friends, I wanted to give maybe a couple of minutes on what happened in America in 2016 as we move to our next part of this session. The dominant narrative has been Trump won, therefore fact-checking lost, right? I think this is a deeply flawed narrative for several reasons. The first is that all elections are not won or lost on facts, right? This is an angsty liberal commentator's approach to dealing with Trump's victory, to explain it away as people who don't understand the facts didn't vote. In 2008 and 2012, people didn't swarm to the voting place to vote for Obama on facts. They were voting him on that hopey-changey thing, right? And that's been the case with Trump too. The facts aren't what they can determine a voting choice, but that's not what politics is won and lost on necessarily. A fact checker's job is to get the stuff out. What the electorate does with it is another thing. And I mention this because it has sort of overshadowed the fact that, yes, on the one hand, we had a candidate who literally belched whoppers every other day. He would say ridiculous things about the Twin Towers, about Obama's birth certificate, about the unemployment rate being 42%, except when he became president, it suddenly magically turned back down to 5%, which is a neat little trick. So I don't want to underestimate the absurdity of the relationship with facts that President Donald Trump has. On the other side, I also don't want to underestimate the year that 2016 was for fact checkers. PolitiFact had 110 million page views in a year. That's a lot of page views for a fact checker. NPR did an annotated version of the transcripts, fact-checking the debates live. That was their most successful web piece in history. So there was an enormous demand for this kind of content in 2016. That doesn't mean that did it not reach everyone? Did it not matter? I think we'll see studies that hopefully will tell us a little bit more because we're none the wiser. And I also don't want to absolve fact checkers in the United States. So I think there have been two big errors with fact checking in 2016 in the US context. The first was, we touched upon this earlier, this literalist obsession. Trump uses hyperbole almost exclusively, right? I am the biggest, I am the greatest, the best in history, and so on. And so when he said things like, Obama founded ISIS, or when he said things like, let me come up with some more, but those kinds of outrageous claims that were totally out there, his voters didn't really care about that literal thing. He was sort of dog whistling, whatever the saying is. And so this rush to fact check that specific thing, including down to very silly examples. During a debate, Trump said that Hillary Clinton bleached her emails. And there was a big, maybe some of you saw this, a big graphic on NBC saying, nope, she actually used a software called BleachBit. And no one was really thinking that Hillary Clinton had gotten all her emails in a bucket full of bleach and was one by one getting them out. Just like no one thought when Kane said that Donald Trump had a personal Mount Rushmore of dictators, no one thought that really Donald Trump had built a mountain in his backyard with Kim Jong-un and the like. And yet, some of this silly fact-checking still was going on because it got clicks and because there was a rush of people to do it because it was so easy, and it lost the trust of people. People thought, hey, this is a gimmick. This isn't real. And so when there were fact checks on the fact that actually unemployment rate is not 42%, that actually crime is at one of its historically low levels, the skeptic had that weapon, had that other silly fact check to say, these guys anyway aren't doing anything good. So I think that's one big thing. And the other thing, which is a good way to lead to the next speaker, is that in the United States, fact checkers let themselves be dragged into a role of adversaries specific to one candidate. It wasn't through their own, most of the time. There were definitely people who were fact checking because they hated Donald Trump, and that showed. But even when these were independent organizations, they got dragged into the pit because Trump would call them scum and would call them all kinds of names. But in that context, you rise above. You do not respond in kind. You do not make all the stupid things that Trump said last week. That's not how fact-checking works. And I think it will, to dig out of the mess it is in the United States, it could do well to be more of an advocate on behalf of users and voters than an adversary of politicians. And this is a line I stole really without any shame from Phoebe's boss. So I'm happy to open with Full Fact that has this kind of approach, or more of this approach. And I wanted to ask you, Phoebe, obviously you guys sort of started the post-truth silliness, which I blame you for, when the Brexit referendum went for leave. So I'm wondering, did you see the leave vote as evidence that facts were dead?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Great, cool. So I completely agree with everything you just said, which is a good start. But first of all, a bit of context, which I think is kind of what you're driving at. All of these problems have been here for longer than the last year. Full Fact has been making the case that misinformation is damaging to society and democracy for the last 9 years. We were set up 7 years ago, but it took us 2 years to get going. Trust is low and stable. People don't trust politicians, and it's been that way for a very long time. It's not a new crisis of trust. And then finally, getting neutral, reliable information to people is hard because, as you're kind of hinting, often the truth isn't that exciting. And I think you're going to talk a bit more about that later, aren't you? And then a bit of context around the actual referendum in the UK itself. It was quite an unusual vote in a way because there was an astounding amount of ignorance about the EU. And you probably remember people were sort of laughing at British citizens because the second most Googled question after the referendum was, what is the EU? Which is kind of funny initially, but actually really not funny when you think about it. The second thing that's quite difficult for us as fact checkers is that a lot of the claims were speculative. So instead of having kind of solid claims to check with data or analysis we could look up, we were kind of having to talk a lot of the time about how you can't have that kind of certainty about a claim about the future. So a lot of what we were doing is calling out spurious certainty. And then finally, it was, as you probably know, most of you, a really polarized debate. So for that reason, we actually decided not to take our normal approach of intervening when we found something was accurate. So normally, and this is my job, we go and ask for corrections when we find that something is wrong, for really big claims, not for every claim, because we don't have the resources. But for this referendum, because we knew our reputation, we'd be completely trashed and dragged through the mud if we were that aggressive. So we decided not to do that, and instead we focused on explaining, partly because of the reason I just said, which is that people didn't know that much about the EU. So I was going to go through a few of the types of claims that we saw, if you'd be interested in that. The first one, as I said, was spurious claims, spurious certainty, where people were speculating about the future. A lot of that was economists saying, like, using our models, this is what we expect. But some of it was just people saying, all of these jobs will be lost if we leave the EU. And, you know, we couldn't prove that, and no one could prove that. That was more of an opinion than a factual claim, but it was often being presented as fact. The second kind is where you had an accurate claim that was completely true and fair, but maybe only really compelling to one side. So the best example of this is probably immigration is at a record high, which is true. Immigration in the UK is at a record high. But if you tell that to somebody on the Remain side, they really didn't want to hear it, and they just said that that was not true. But I'm going to tweet some of this stuff afterwards because I didn't have time to do a presentation and put the graph up. But the facts on this are astonishing. Like, the graph goes, from your point of view, like that. immigration is at a record high and a really high record. But again, as I said, not particularly compelling to the opposite side of the argument. The third kind of claim that I think was quite common was where things were exaggerated, so kind of true but not fair. I think that's probably the majority of claims that were made during the referendum, from my point of view. So for those sorts of claims, we're filling in shades of grey. Probably the best examples are both sides claiming what Turkey was going to do with the EU. So Leave were claiming that Turkey is going to join the EU. Remain was saying, no, that's never going to happen. But actually, they were both completely exaggerating the situation. So it is actually official UK government policy, or it was at least then, for Turkey to join the EU eventually. But there are like so many things they need to do before they can join the EU that it was ridiculous also for Leave to claim that they were going to join the EU. And then the final kind of claim, number 4, is just straight down inaccurate claims. So, for example, you had Remain saying, we control our borders. That's not true. We had people saying for the past 2 or 3 years that 3 million jobs depend directly on the EU. We've been fact-checking that one for 2 years since the European Parliament elections in earnest. And by the time the EU referendum came around, people had dropped the idea of these jobs directly depending on the EU. So they were starting to say they depend on the EU, which was slightly better, if still speculative. But that took us 2 years to get to that stage. So I guess my point there is you need to be fact-checking for a long time if you want to make a dent in some of these claims. And then the last one, which you probably all heard and are really sick of, like me, the claim that we send £350 million to the EU every week. Again, it's hugely exaggerated. Lots of people said that it was inaccurate. We have a theory about how that claim came about, and we think it's because the source data wasn't very clear. But anyway, lots of people called it out. But it was on the side of their bus, their battle bus, so they couldn't very well get rid of it by that point. And I think that's maybe why they kept using it, that this is the Vote Leave people. But it is really important to note that that claim wasn't used in the final BBC debate. So I think although a lot of the literature that Vote Leave were using had this claim on it, and they couldn't kind of redesign it like with 2 weeks to go, they did actually drop it by the end of the referendum campaign.
And you sort of addressed where you thought you did well and you came short. So I do have another question for you though, which is, can you tell the room, which may not be necessarily familiar with Full Fact's work, how you did frame which topics you chose, etc.? Because unlike many fact checkers around the world, you don't start from the single claim of the politician and go from there, but you, especially with the EU, you did a bit of an experiment into figuring out which issues to fact check. So maybe a couple of sentences on that.
Sure. So I guess the big thing to say, which I think you're maybe coming on to later, is there are so many claims you could check. So you've kind of got to be a bit strategic about how you go about it. So one of the ways that we decide how we check, what we check, is by topics. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ipsos Mori, the polling company, but they do a survey every month where they ask people, what do you think are the most important issues facing Britain today? And it's a free response, so you can say whatever you want, and then the company, Ipsos Mori, compiles this into basic categories. And the ones that always come out at the top, which we base our fact-checking on, are immigration, the economy, health, crime, education, and now Brexit, and housing. And so they did a similar thing to that for the EU referendum, where they asked people what issues were going to decide their vote. And that's basically how we decided what things we were going to explain. The other factors that went into what we covered and what we explained were the most Google questions on the EU. So there were things like, what is the EU, which I just mentioned? What is the single market? Really, some really, really basic questions that we would never have guessed people were trying to find the answers to. And then we also went out to membership organizations like 38 Degrees, which is a kind of big online petitions organization, and the Federation of Small Businesses, which is what it sounds like. It's kind of business trade association. And we asked them to ask their members what they wanted us to check and what they wanted us to explain. And then we took those answers, and that's kind of how we got to where we got to with what we covered. Yeah.
All right, thank you. If we could get the slide a moment up as well, just as an intro to the next, our next speaker. On the right, you will see a graphic that Pagella Politica prepared at the tail end of the referendum for changing the constitution here in Italy last December. essentially replicating, bringing the model that Craig Silverman had done for BuzzFeed in the US of engagements of fake news stories and real news stories to the Italian context. So Giovanni, I wondered, I'm rolling these two things together. One, what did you learn from covering the constitutional referendum? And two, Italy has been a sort of a hotbed for discussion on legislating about fake news. So do you think that conversation is going places? Should it go places? Did fact-checking the referendum sort of make you believe that there should be legislation?
Yeah, thank you. Well, during the campaign toward the referendum, we covered it essentially in two ways. So we did the usual, fact-checking of singular statements and of politicians. And what we learned from this was that the discussion about the referendum was around really technical issues. So the political pundits and the commentators, and even the journalists, were focused on the really technical and difficult details of our constitution, our form of government. And so we could think that people were starting to learn the complicated ways the new Senate was going to be elected or something like this. But then we did this research, this experiment, and we discovered something else. And the results were somewhat surprising because I didn't expect that in Italy there was something like there was in the US when BuzzFeed published this piece about the fact that some of the most viral news stories about the election were fake. But actually we used the same tool and we discovered that even in Italy there was something like this. And it was really surprising because you see here some of the first 5 statements that were more with the most social interactions on the internet in the days before the referendum. And the first one was this wildly false claim, obviously, that they found 500,000 ballots already voted with yes. And yes was the result searched and hoped for by the former prime minister. So that was surprising because the number of the social interaction on each of these items was huge. And so I discovered, and we discovered at Pagella, that there was this enormous iceberg of public discourse, of social interaction, of social news, social media buzz, and so on, that was around largely false claims. And then I wondered, so I'm missing like the largest part of the public opinion. Where is this kind of people? I've never discussed with a friend the fact that they found 500,000 already voted ballots. Then something happened. One day I was talking with a university professor. He's an expert of Renaissance literature. And he knows that I'm a journalist, and he asked me something like, what do you think about the Syrian war or something like this in foreign policy? And I started to say something, and he really contested every single factual claim that I was mentioning. And so I said, I see that there's not so much ground for discussion here. How is it possible? And his answer was revealing for me, because he said, well, I don't read newspapers anymore. I only use counter-information, which is, I found it astonishing. And the fact that it came from a university professor, and one was, essays are really difficult to read, about the Neapolitan Renaissance in the 16th century, was really informing using this kind of source of information. So maybe the problem was one of perspective. We as fact-checkers and journalists were looking at a public opinion that really wasn't existing, where the largest part was at least seeing something like the 500,000 ballots and already voted and so on. And the other claims were similarly widely false. And the last thing that we learned from this is that during the weeks going to the referendum, we saw maybe for the first time a type of fake news that was specifically designed to be to go viral and be highly shared on the social network. It is a little bit too difficult to explain in another language, because this has something to do with the Italian language, and the point is that there were some fake news sites that used names almost equal to established newspapers. For example, one is an Italian right-wing newspaper is Il Giornale, and there was this fake news site that was Il Giornale, which is a small typo, which is, if you go to the page of this media outlet, this fake news outlet, you see that you immediately understand that they are even trying to do it equal to the original one. But why does it work? Why does it go viral? Because on a really popular social media, Facebook, can I say that? You see the source only as a small script in gray. And so a small typo like this is almost undetectable. And in this way, this was clever, because in this way you can be sure that something on Facebook will be really widely spread. And me, for example, I spent some seconds more than once to see, wait a moment, is this true? And then it wasn't, because there was the small typo. So from the technical to the general, I went from the general to the technical. Those are the main lessons. As per your second question, yeah, it's true that in Italy we are discussing a lot about laws about fake news. And this is, I think, for two reasons. One has to do with the Italian context. And the problem is that we in Italy, we tend to produce too much laws. Every time that something goes to the front page of a newspaper, or even to the inner pages, somebody is thinking of doing a law about it. I remember a debate some years ago about the blogs. And there was all a discussion about freedom of speech on the internet and on the blogs. And so this has to do with the Italian context. Everyone, but at the same time, there's really a small digital literacy, a low digital yeah, you got it. In this country, so more or less, every time the expert says that those laws are not written so good, and most of the time it doesn't go anywhere. But in this specific issue, I think that it is the result of the effort of one person, which is the president of the Chamber of Deputies, Laura Boldrini, which is a left-wing politician and former spokesperson for the High Commissioner for the Refugees of the United Nations. And she, from the start, since she was elected from his position, her position, she took a particular care to follow some issues about internet and the freedom of speech and the hate crimes and so on. In 2015, she made a commission of deputies about the rights and duties of users of the internet. So it is a concern of hers since a lot of time. But if I should make a guess, I think that this isn't going really... how do you say it? I think that a law will not be possible, and that it isn't even the right way to go.
Alrighty, we're a little short on time, so I'm going to ask you a long question to which you'll give us a short answer.
Yeah.
I get to do that because we used to work together. So. The first time I was in IJF presenting Pagella Politica in my old job, the panel was called, and Italians will know what it is, Tutti pazzi per il fact-checking. So everyone's crazy about fact-checking. And so besides us, a lot of media outlets just poured into fact-checking and then quickly got bored and pulled back out. I'm seeing another round of that. a little bit. I'm seeing that again, everyone, tutti sono pazzi per il fact-checking. I wonder whether you'll see that to stick. And I guess, is there a reason that in Italy, unlike in France, in the US, in the UK, there isn't really a home for a fact-checking project in a major media outlet? I mean, obviously we partner with RAI, you partner with RAI, but there isn't Corriere or Repubblica or those kind of outlets.
Well, I think that I do not share this a particular pessimism about this, because in the last few weeks and months I see a new rising interest in fact-checking. We see it more on TV shows, and we have got a long-standing cooperation with RAI 2, which we have a small segment on the Italian national broadcasting, but and it is important, and we can only go better than after this. But I think that the point here is that we in Italy as a culture, I would say, we are almost always, I would say, 20 years later on everything. So, we in 2013, there was a guy elected talking about Tony Blair, and you can confirm me that Tony Blair is not so popular in the UK since like 15 years, so it was not the right example to pick. But I would bet on the fact that in 5 to 10 years, a lot of major news outlets will invest in fact-checking, and maybe then we will elect a president that wants to build up a great wall with Austria. I hope.
All right,
I'm okay with it.
Thank you. I want to pass to the final part of our panel before opening up to questions. I see three main challenges for fact-checking everywhere, and I wanted to give each of them a few minutes to give us an answer. So the first is that it's perceived to be a part of the same media ecosystem that did not tell the truth on the crisis, whether it was economic or of immigration or of the refugees or of wars abroad or near. The second is that fact-checkers are reliant on sources of facts, academia, science, expertise that are themselves being attacked. And for years, fact-checkers would say, you don't need to trust us. We're showing you all our sources. This is what you need to trust. But if that source of authority goes, the edifice risks to crumble. And then the final risk, or the final main challenge, I think, is, as you were saying before, there's the tip of the iceberg that fact-checkers try to clean up and take down, or whatever you do to tips of icebergs. But then there's like a big-ass iceberg underneath that we're not really addressing of fake output. So I have an idea that I'll leave to the end, but I was wondering whether we could go in the inverse order. I start from Giovanni again and say, what ideas do you have for getting us out of this trouble?
Well, we discussed this a little before lunch, and I know that there's a minority opinion, but I think that the new challenge for fact-checking is to make it cool. So the fact is, fact-checking is quite simple as a process. You take a statement, you take the data, and you show if the factual claim is accurate or not. And so what's the problem is to get it mainstream, to reach people, and to make it, I think that the only way is to invest in new formats, in new way of presenting it, in smarter, and even in searching to go viral with our stories, with our articles, with our discussion of the statements. So that's my point.
Yeah.
No.
Well, I'm kind of in two minds about it, because we definitely reached a lot of people online by investing a huge amount, for us, of money in videos and Facebook advertising. So I think we spent £25,000 during the referendum on videos and advertising, and we reached 3 million people, which is much, much, much more than we've ever reached before. And they were really cool videos. So I agree on that point. But I also think working with the media is really important, which is why I think it's good that you guys have your partnership. And we did a lot of that during the referendum. I think we did something like 69 interviews and briefings for media outlets. Most of them were national. And obviously, people aren't necessarily going to come to your site unless they happen to find you on Google which has been made much easier since Google launched their fact check tag in the main search today or yesterday. But yeah, I think you kind of have to take your fact checks to where people are. But on your first question about kind of like the mainstream media and fact checking kind of becoming part of that, I think that two ways you can guard against it, if any of you are thinking of setting up fact checking organizations, is first of all, I think not telling people what to think is really important. I think you've got to give them the tools to make up their own mind. I'm very wary of saying this because it's quite contentious within the fact-checking world, would you believe? But this is why Full Fact doesn't really use ratings, partly. We think that it doesn't really encourage people to judge the claim for themselves. And then the second thing is playing the ball, not the man, which basically means that we fact-check claims and not people. So again, this is why we don't call people liars. We just don't think it's very constructive if you're trying to get politicians to change their behaviour, but also I don't think it encourages your audience to trust you and kind of think that you're reasonable, like you have a reasonable voice. Yeah.
So I'll just add to that by saying it is really important, I think, to play the ball and not the man, because the sort of core underlying problem is this very rapidly declining level of trust in media and in other public institutions. This is a long-standing problem, although I think it's reached sort of really frightening new lows, in the last several years. But just as a reference point, in the United States, for instance, as recently as the 1970s, something like 3/4 of people in surveys said that they had at least a fair amount of trust, right? A fair amount of trust or a great deal of trust in the media, and today that figure is below 1/3. So there's been a really dramatic reduction in people's level of trust. Again, that's been a gradual process. It's linked to media fragmentation and to greater polarization of the electorate in general. The frightening fact is that while you would hope that fact-checking would help to restore people's trust in journalism, because it's so clearly an effort to, provide a service to the reader and to get at the truth, there's every reason to think that because it takes issue directly with claims and because it responds to politicians who people sometimes like once in a while, it can actually further diminish people's trust in the media, or it runs the risk of confirming their belief that the media is biased. Now, that doesn't mean we should stop fact-checking, obviously. It just means that it's really important, as Phoebe's saying, to underscore that these are nonpartisan outlets that are playing, they're checking claims, they're not declaring war on politicians. Alexios was also making this point. Fact-checkers have to do everything possible to show people what kinds of information sources they're using, that these are nonpartisan information sources, and that they don't take sides in larger political questions.
I'll just wrap this up before passing it to you guys. I have, I think, two macro ideas or hopes for how we get out of this. One is teaching, and it's both through example and through physically going into classrooms. And I was highly heartened. Sunday, you may not have known, but I probably didn't know. But it was the inaugural International Fact-Checking Day. It came, not surprisingly, after April Fools, and we really didn't know whether it was going to be anything. But what surprised me was that we had a lesson plan translated in 13 languages for our high school kids. We asked teachers to tell us how many students they were aiming to reach with that lesson plan. I have to make the premise, I don't know, we're going to make a follow-up to see whether they actually taught it. But that big premise being made, if they actually did teach, that lesson plan reached more than 80,000 students around the world. I think there's an enormous demand for this type of skill, especially of dealing with misinformation online in schools. Teachers know it, and fact-checkers need to be their allies in doing that. The other thing I'd say is, in the early aughts, fact-checkers were sort of seminal in turning the hyperlink into an industry standard, that you had to link to your source, that you had to point to where you got the information. And now it's just kind of part of the architecture, so we don't really pay attention to it. Fake news sites have links, like they have a headline and a picture, like that's just how they are. So I hope and believe that fact checkers can lead the way to the next leap for transparency of sourcing. I think that means inevitably more context. I think that means that one day when you hover over a link on a fact-checking site, it tells you the metadata, the limits of that stuff, and that you can then see how many times that fact-checking organization has quoted those sources over unofficial sources. But I would urge you guys, if you have thoughts and ideas in this space, reach out to us. We are thirsty for good suggestions. We have 9.5 minutes for questions, and I would love 4, but it's 2:51. She's being mean to me. Okay, please, the lady with the raised hand.
Hello, Nika from Project DFR Lab. We are doing digital forensics and oftentimes fact-checking. What's your approach if you find a story which mentions anonymous source from a police also, because it's also a journalism practice, and at the same time it could be a very good way how you could input some false information. How would you fact check such information provided in the news story?
Yeah, I can go first. So, like Alexios says, we always, full fact, always links to sources for any factual assertion that we're making. So often if something is just said to us that our readers can't then go and check for themselves, we just won't include it in articles, which is a bit of a shame, maybe. But it's just such a cornerstone for us that people can follow links or can go and look something up for themselves.
Anyone?
No, I wouldn't. Yeah, I would agree that something said as a confidential source simply can't be fact-checked. You need to leave that aside, I would say.
Other questions? We've exhausted the question. Oh, down there, bottom right of the.
It was to ask to expand a bit on the idea of additional information being available about a source. For example, if you hovered over a link. What do you find are the most impactful pieces of information about a source that help people to make their minds up about whether it's trustworthy or not?
And this is partly research, partly gut, so please do go away and fact check me after this. But my thing is, we need to explain uncertainty far more than we have ever done. And it came sort of with I think the main criminals here were the data viz obsessed people, that there was data visualization without verification, because it was data, you'd have to trust it. And obviously the way that data is collected, you need to put a lot of caveats on that stuff. And so I think explaining to your readers, hey, this was collected in such a way, there are limitations to asking people whether they've had an abortion, for instance. And if it's an international statistic, rape is considered differently in Sweden than it is in the United States. So adding all those, I think adding that kind of context of what the data doesn't tell you is, I think, maybe the number one thing that would probably provide trust to readers. And the way I think readers really respect telling them, when you tell them that you are fallible. When Pagella Politica, when I was still working there, introduced a corrections policy and pegged on the front page of our website every single mistake we made, I think that's still one of our most engaged posts in history. So I think people accept that you are human and that your data is made by humans too. I hope that's an answer. Anyone?
I would just add briefly to that I think that if you can show people how widely cited a source is, say it's an official statistic, a source of jobs numbers, for instance, if you can show people how widely cited it is, how long it's been around, and especially that it's relied upon by members of different political parties, that helps to reaffirm that it's trustworthy and that they should take it seriously.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you just said. There's a new institution called the Winton Centre that's been set up at Cambridge and just been given loads and loads of millions of pounds, lucky them. But one of the things that the first things they're going to be doing is working out how you explain uncertainty to people, and kind of using like psychological methods, like social science, like communication techniques. So hopefully they will have something for you, Alexios.
Flash question from the front, and we'll get out of this. Yeah, no, flash question, flash answer. When Italian says like
Thank
this,
you.
you're in trouble.
I have a question regarding your final 3 questions or problems you described, because you kind of said that one way to work with that is to check the claim, not the person. But on the other hand, this made me wonder, because previously you said that there is the problem of false balance. And this brings me, for example, to a site like PolitiFact, where you can see for politicians how many lies they would have provided people with, and you see that there is often not a balance. And so your solution, I think, at some point you might probably have to say that there is not a balance there. And I also see the big danger at fact-checking sites that you just try to be fair, and even small rumors from the other side, perhaps, you cover them because you want to cover anything. So I'm not sure how you would find a balance there.
Can I ask Phoebe to take that as an active fact checker, and then we shut it down because I'll get beaten up if we don't.
So, yes. Although there are fact checkers around the world who do kind of draw up charts of who's lied the most, we haven't done that yet because we don't. I know this sounds like such a cop-out, but we don't genuinely check a representative or random sample of politicians. So there's no way that we as fact-checkers who criticise other people's use of data every day can treat data in that way. But we are working on automation software which will help us to track how many times claims are being made and who they're being made by. So it's possible that in the future we could have more robust answers to who's lying the most, or not that we call it lying, but...
All right, great questions. Hopefully we'll have a chance to follow up afterwards. Sorry, guys, but they're throwing flames at me from the back. Thank you so much for coming. Hope you had a good time.
I'll be in Madrid,
Sorry for my delayed entry. I was hoping to do a bit like... I was hoping, were you at the Mosseri talk earlier on Adam Mosseri, the head of Newsfeed? He sort of entered very gloriously, as they do in Silicon Valley, or pretend claps. Anyway, welcome all. Fact-checking is a topic that has been on a lot of front pages. There has been a lot of concern as to whether this tool is useless, as to whether this tool is done for, and that we should just give up on reality and truths. I hope we will spend an hour speaking without cliches about what fact-checking can and can't do. I am thrilled to do that with people who actually know what they're talking about. The challenge with when a topic becomes popular is that everyone thinks they should get an opinion about it, and definitely fact-checking hasn't been an exception. So, from nearest to me, Lucas Graves is a professor of journalism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has literally written the book about American fact-checking for Columbia University Press. Next up, Phoebe Arnold is the head of communications of the great British fact-checking site Full Fact. They are an extremely thoughtful fact-checking organization when it comes to the impact of their work. So I'm delighted to have her with us. And then last but not least is my former colleague Giovanni Zagni, who runs the Italian fact-checking site Pagella Politica. And I guess a bit of who the hell am I is probably in place. My name is Alexis Mansarlis, and as of September 2015, I am the director of the International Fact-Checking Network. If that means nothing to you, and I say this all the time, it means nothing to a lot of people, including my father and the customs officials, who sort of do this when I tell them what my job is. But the International Fact-Checking Network is an alliance of fact-checking organizations, more than 100 around the world. We try to promote high standards among fact-checkers and share best practices. You may have seen us in the news most recently because in December, when Facebook decided to start fighting fake news in one way or another, there's only one rule to this panel, and it's important for you to know it. If you say post-truth or post-fact to someone on this panel, we'll take a shot. So please don't make us reach the end of this panel totally drunk. And there is one premise that I want to make, because so much coverage has been about, lol, do facts even matter? Yes, facts do matter. This is the most recent of studies that showed that corrections on Trump voters of Trump misinformation did change their minds, did improve the accuracy of their understanding. And we can talk about this later, but I just want to make sure that we don't spend an hour either thinking this is the perfect tool or inversely thinking, why are we even bothering? It's a bunch of it's a very nuanced situation, and I hope we'll walk through it together. All right, so for the first part of our chat, I'm turning to Lucas, who is sort of a sociologist and a historian of the American fact-checking scene. Obviously, for those of you who don't know, political fact-checking in the United States sort of broke through with factcheck.org in 2003 and then PolitiFact winning the Pulitzer in 2008, but it leaned on third-party fact-checkers. Those fact-checkers have to have signed on to the Code of Principles that the organization I lead has published. So what are we going to do today? We'll talk a little bit about how we got here, right? The problem when something gets really popular is that we presume it just started, and there's obviously a bit of history, and I'm glad obviously Lucas will help us go through that. We'll look, because it's in everyone's mind, what the fuck happened in 2016 around the world. I'm sure I'm not going to be delicate. A lot of fucks happened. And then we're going to think a bit of where we're going next. What does fact-checking need to do to adapt to this new context in which we're in, and what is not in fact-checking's purview. And then we'll give 15 minutes for Q&A. There are so many festivals in which, so many journalism talks have been in the past 6 weeks, where it's all among journalists, it's all closed doors. I'm so thrilled to have the public, for this to be an open event. So your hardest possible questions, the panelists will be happy to receive them, right? Goes even further back. So I wanted to ask Lucas to sort of set the stage before we even get to 2016. How did we get here? Can you tell us a little bit about the early history of fact-checking? Where did it start, and what were some of its innovations?
Sure. So,
is it on? You may need to press. Great.
Sure, I'm happy to. So, first of all, I think it's really important to underscore that for most of the 20th century, directly challenging political claims, even claims that were clearly false, was not the norm for American journalists, who very often were, quite close to the officials they were covering, and felt, would have felt uncomfortable challenging their claims. There was a reporter in the wake of the Red Scare, the sort of communist witch hunts in the 1950s in the U.S., who complained that that objectivity, the objectivity norm in journalism, had become basically a transmission belt for falsehoods during the Red Scare, because politicians like Joe McCarthy, these demagogues, could count on journalists to faithfully repeat and report, their wildest claims about the number of communists